Joining me live is columnist for The Weekend Australian and author Gerard Henderson. He also wrote the book, Cardinal Pell, The Media Pylon and Collective Guilt. Gerard, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
In 2017, George Pell became the highest-ranking Vatican official to be charged with child abuse offences. He was 76 at the time, and at the time of his arrest he said, "I'm looking forward to finally having my day in court. I repeat that I am innocent of these charges. They are false. The whole idea of sexual abuse is abhorrent to me." Can you describe to us what the media reporting was like leading up to those charges being laid?
Well, it was incredibly hostile. Not every part of the media, but certainly the ABC, The Guardian, Australia and other places. It was incredible, and most of the 9 newspapers like The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald was incredibly hostile. And in such a circumstance, it would be very difficult for anyone to receive a fair trial. Now, as you know, George Pell was convicted on 5 charges on the second trial. The jury at the first trial couldn't reach a decision. The jury at the second trial reached a decision after over 4 days out. And of course that was appealed. But the hostility to George Pell, which came partly in the media and partly because of the media's reporting of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, that was very hostile to George Pell, because people get up and make allegations months before he had any chance to reply. And as we know, there's no right of appeal against the Royal Commission finding any rate. So it was a very hostile environment. I'm not aware of anyone who had such a hostile environment in recent times. Lindy Chamberlain, about 4 decades ago, had also a hostile media, and in time her conviction was also quashed after a jury had found her guilty.
In that successful High Court appeal, there's this famous quote from Chief Justice Susan Kiefel that says, "It is evident that there is a possibility that an innocent person has been convicted because the evidence did not establish guilt to the requisite standard of proof." After that decision unanimously was made by those judges, what was the media's response after that decision was made and he was released from prison?
Well, it's an interesting quote you make there, because it's rare that a High Court or an appeal court would even use the word innocent in relation to an acquittal. That's rare. It had been used in the Chamberlain case and it was used in the Pell case. So what happened was that there were a lot of journalists, in particular Louise Milligan, I have in mind, Melissa Davey writing in The Guardian, Louise Milligan on the ABC and others, but not David Marr. So some of the journalists who led the criticism of Pell effectively refused to accept the High Court judgment. And if you read Louise Milligan's book, Witness, she really doesn't accept the judgment. But most people did, because what was extraordinary about the judgment was not so much the strength of the judgment, but that it was 7-0. I mean, it's rare that a High Court in that kind of decision would come down 7-0, but I believe that George Pell needed a 7-0 decision because of the hostility to him. And so whilst some people came around and accepted, some of his critics came around and accepted the judgment, others didn't, but it's worth reading, because it's a 35-page judgment, which is quite short for a High Court judgment. It's very well written, it's very easy to read, and what the High Court demonstrated is what Pell and his legal counsel had always said, that no one could ever explain how the offences of sexual assault against 2 young boys at St Patrick's Cathedral in Melbourne at a solemn high mass at 11 o'clock on a Sunday, when there are hundreds of people in the area and he's surrounded by his own master of ceremonies and altar service and other priests and their visitors and their tourists. I mean, this is a very busy place, as he described it, and as the High Court described it. It was a hive of activity, and the idea that he could have assaulted 2 boys in the priest sacristy with the door open, I mean, no one's been able to explain how it could have happened. And the High Court makes that very clear. There was another charge which was even more preposterous now, which was that he suddenly groped a boy in a group of 50, suddenly came up and identified the boy, groped him, and then came back to the back of the procession without anyone seeing it. And there were 50 people in that vicinity. And the real point here is that where the error really starts, the media is complicit, or sections of the media are complicit. But the error starts with Victoria Police, who charged George Pell with 26 offences originally and ended up with 0 convictions. Now, if you're playing rugby league or rugby union and you go down 26 zip, it's a bad defeat. But Victoria Police said it was all very good. Everything they did was fine. I mean, it was a devastating defeat. And then you had the Victorian Labor government, in particular the Premier, making hostile statements about Cardinal Pell. You had Victoria Police going after him. You had a hostile media. But in the end, after serving over 400 days in prison, in effectively solitary confinement for his own security, not because he was an offender of that regard, but because of his security, 400 days in solitary confinement, he was acquitted in a stunning judgment, which followed the judgment of one judge in the Victorian Court of Appeal, Justice Weinberg, which is one of the most devastating minority judgments ever given in a criminal court case in Australia. So it went from Justice Weinberg's dissent against two others in the Victorian Court of Appeal to a unanimous decision in the High Court. And if you read the judgment, it's pretty clear that the charges never should have been laid, but they were. But eventually, justice was done, but it took over a year.
Well, Gerard Henderson, we've got to leave it there, but I really appreciate you joining us on the program today.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.